Hello, good afternoon. Thanks so much for coming. I'm going to talk a bit about micromobility and give an update of what we as McKinsey think about micromobility and how we think the market is going to evolve. My name is Kersten Heinecke. I lead the McKinsey Center for Future Mobility, which is our think tank on the mobility disruption. My work is a combination of micromobility, of shared mobility, of autonomous vehicles. I work with startups, with scale-ups. I also work with more classic incumbent players, but always on topics related to the future of mobility. I would like to share 7 key insights on micromobility and also on something that we call mini-mobility. And I'll say more about mini-mobility in a minute. So I'm going to talk about market sizing. I'm going to deep dive into e-bikes because that is one of the cells in the market that we are even more excited about. Going to talk about mini-mobility, going to talk about regulation, especially for shared e-kick scooters, which, as you all know, is also a hot topic, especially if we look at our friends in France. Going to talk about consumer preferences across different modes and across different ownership factors. And then again, I'm going to do another deep dive into something we call mini-mobility. To kick us off, we do lots of market sizing. So as part of our Center for Future Mobility, we have a team of 45 people that do very little else except size different markets, do analyses, ask consumers. This is what this team and what we have come up with for micromobility. I think the good news is it's growing, and it's growing quite massively. You can also see that this growth is happening across almost all of the regions, and that the majority of the growth, and actually quite a massive share of the growth, is coming from Europe. So we are very convinced that with the climate change target that the EU has set, with the climate change targets that the cities have set, and also with the way how regulators are pushing more infrastructure for micromobility, the European micromobility market will continue to grow very massively until 2030. And this is not yet our most aggressive scenario, so we even have scenarios that go beyond that. Going a bit more into electric bicycles. So in our mind, e-bikes are a big growing market. As you can see here, the question is then, where's all that growth coming from, and sort of where's actually the market size coming from today? And as you can see today, value pool-wise, unit-wise also, but especially value pool-wise, the electric bikes already today make up a massive share of the entire value pool. And if we look forward, this share is only going to continue, simply because we do see that that the share of electric bicycles is going to continuously and steadily increase across all of the different countries and regions. And obviously, the average electric bicycle is more expensive than the average conventional bicycle. Hence, we see the value pool growing even more. So not only do we have a market that is growing in terms of relevance when it comes to units and kilometers traveled, but it's also growing massively in value because the average vehicle, if you will, the average bicycle, is just increasing in value with electrification. Then let me talk about something we call mini-mobility, and I know it's not an official term. I know we took the term micro-mobility from Horace Didio, and I can't give him enough credit for it. But mini-mobility is something that we think is not quite as small as micro-mobility, but not quite as big as most of the cars and the other things that we're seeing. So micro-mobility would be a car like the Microlino, for example, where you have a smaller vehicle that has 4 wheels, maybe 3 wheels, is definitely something smaller than a car, but also provides a certain coverage, a certain protection from weather and from other things. And it's also something where you can not only go yourself, but you can also take somebody or something with you. And because of this, because of the fact that it actually addresses more use cases, we are very excited about this market. And we are also very excited about this market because in our mind, individual mobility, and especially taking your own vehicle into an urban environment, will become more and more difficult, more and more costly, and more regulated in the next couple of years, especially in Europe, but also in other geographies. And we do think that this mini-mobility, so these vehicles in between cars and bicycles, are definitely a form factor that can prosper a lot because it combines the idea of having your own vehicle, being sort of protected against weather and other elements, but then also the idea that we need to reduce the footprint, the space that is actually being covered by a vehicle that you take into the city. And you can also argue that probably it's smarter to take a small vehicle into the city than a big SUV, but I'm not going to argue that here. One last thought on mini-mobility. I think we're still in the early days of this. That's also why we have these sizable market sizes. And this is a market where basically the theoretical potential is massive. It's not that today the market is this large or that we're anyhow close to that, simply because there are no vehicles and the consumer is also still sort of getting used to this and getting into it. But the potential, if we just think about how many trips are short, how many people live in urban environments, and also, if we think about what consumers say, and I'm going to talk about that later, how much they would like to use this is quite significant. And then one last sentence on mini-mobility. The form factors are also not set out yet. I mean, there are some small vehicles here. Some of them have 4 wheels. Some others might have 3 wheels. I was also at Eurobike in June in Frankfurt, and you see different vehicles that look much more like a bicycle than actually a car. So we're basically meeting a bit in the middle between the bike industry, if you will, and the car industry. And the form factors are going to look very, very different and are going to cater to different use cases. If we talk about regulation, especially e-kick scooter regulation is something we looked at because it's obviously hotly debated, and the fact that Paris decided to ban, or should I say a very small fraction of the population of Paris decided to vote for a ban, and then it was banned. The e-kick scooters, the shared e-kick scooters, is something that also brought it into the press. In our mind, the Paris thing was an isolated incident, or a fairly isolated incident, because if we take a look at how many cities are actually still today putting out tenders for shared e-kick scooters versus how many cities are reducing it or banning it, the cities that are putting it out are still in the vast majority, and especially the outright bans. It's not something that we believe will be a pattern and will continue after Paris into other cities. But nonetheless, if we look at the different cities, we've done archetypes for how regulation can work. There is some cities that do a total ban. This is mostly actually coming from China because that's where it's banned altogether. You have tender regulated and you have open regulated environments, and then you have a few other cities and countries where there is no regulation yet. We do expect that this is all going to evolve eventually towards the tender regulated one. So in our mind, some of the countries and cities that still ban it today will also allow it in a regulated fashion. And we also do believe that these open regulated environments are going to get stricter, and that even the tenders to an extent are going to get stricter. If you've taken a look at what micromobility regulation is in place in Munich, you do see all these parking zones, for example, in the inner city environment. And while it might not be as convenient for the user, it's definitely more convenient for the people who are not using it. So therefore, I think this is something where we are headed, and we're going to go towards more regulation, but in our mind, not outright bans. Consumer insights. So as part of this team that I was mentioning earlier, our 45 people that do nothing but future of mobility in terms of market sizing, we have a huge team that does consumer polling. And one thing we always ask is, which form factor do you actually like? So what would you like to use in terms of micromobility? And what you can see is the bicycle, or the electric bicycle, is, with its heritage, hundreds of years, so to say, or much more than 100 years for bicycles, is still the most common and the most valued and the most appreciated form factor. You can also see that mini-mobility that I was talking about earlier is something that is very much on the horizon. So it's not that people don't know what it is and that they don't know these smaller cars or larger bikes, depending on what it is. And also the e-kick scooter has a certain relevance. You see this especially strong or stronger than in other countries in Germany. In the US, you do see that the idea of mini-mobility is actually already more common than in other geographies. It's called the neighborhood electric vehicle. And you've probably seen videos, pictures of these communities where people are actually driving around in golf cart-like vehicles, and they use the golf cart or a golf cart-like vehicle actually for most of the trips. And we do believe that this is another indicator that this mini-mobility market is actually going to be quite relevant. I've not talked yet about the electric moped. In our mind, another market. If we did have the numbers here for Southern Europe, so for Italy, for Spain, also for France to a certain extent, we would see an even higher preference rate than for Germany. But it is also a relevant form factor. In short, people like all of the different modes. The composition is a bit different. You can also see that the US doesn't have such a big preference for bikes. It's very much rooted in the fact how the US cities look like compared to ours. So the distances are simply longer. So commuting with a bike in most US cities or in most US areas is simply a bit more difficult than it is in a country like Germany or the Netherlands, where it's already even more popular than in Germany. Another consumer insight, we again go a bit deeper into mini-mobility, and we ask them, how would you actually use such a mini-mobility vehicle? Is that something that you would actually not consider at all? Is that something you would use to replace your car entirely? Or is it more the second, third, however manyth vehicle that you would have in your household. And as you can see, it's a bit a tie in most countries, right? So in Germany, at least, there is almost as many people that would use it as an extension as would use it to entirely replace the car. In China, it's slightly more towards the extension, so more like a second, third, however manyth car. And in the US, it's again also a certain replacement, which we actually found interesting. But I think this also is due to the fact that many people are already using it today like this. So again, if you live in such a community, you can actually get by with having just, quote unquote, a golf cart or a neighborhood electric vehicle. And again, this is also something that went into our market size, right? So when I showed the huge total addressable market or theoretical market potential for mini-mobility earlier, we actually had these numbers and used these numbers from the consumer sentiment. Obviously, we deducted them a bit, but you can see that many, many people are quite interested in using mini-mobility. Last but not least, we also asked people about ownership preferences. So not only would you like to use micro-mobility or but not on how would you like to use it, but also how would you like to sort of pay for it, right? And you can see that buying a vehicle, owning it entirely, not financing it, paying for it entirely in cash is something that's super relevant for bicycles. But actually, if you will, the more expensive, but also the larger the vehicle gets, the preference towards not buying the vehicles outright, but maybe paying for them via financing or via subscription is increasing. And the same also partially holds true for sharing. So we can definitely see that scooter sharing and also sharing of mini-mobility potentially, which is nicely in line with the fact that people want to use it to extend their mobility pattern and not replace the car altogether, shows that shared services also have a potential. So if I come back to my first chart that I had on growth, micromobility is growing. This holds true both for the ownership or a vehicle that you have at your home the entire time via leasing or subscription, but also very much so for the shared services. So we do see that this market is a very attractive market, regardless of whether it's, again, an ownership-based or a personal vehicle or a vehicle that you would be sharing. To sum up, seven key takeaways from our side. Growth, so sizable market. Electric bicycles, already today, very important in the market, getting even more important. We do believe that electric bicycles will, as I said before, take up a massive share, and that conventional bicycles will actually be more of a sports thing and a kids thing, rather than an actual way of getting around. Mini-mobility, I don't want to say the next big thing, because that's sort of a strange thing to say, right? But it's another huge market that is going to develop, and we're going to see lots of different form factors evolve and come to market in the next 2, 3, 5 years. And we do believe that this actually has a potential to guarantee individual motorized mobility with a car or a car-like vehicle, while at the same time helping the environment and also help congestion. Urban population and regulation, so it's already heavily regulated. Regulation will evolve. Bicycle, definitely still preferred, but other modes also highly relevant. We have mini-mobility, that is something that people would actually like to either extend the car with or also replace it with entirely. And then last but not least, private ownership is still very prevalent, but sharing is also something that is going to grow. One page on advertising, what we do. So we in McKinsey work with startups, scale-ups, we work with disruptors. We work with incumbents, always on the future of mobility. And ultimately, we try to make businesses better, to make businesses grow, to make businesses find investors and fundings. And that's what we use all of the data that I just showed you. And there is obviously much, much more for. Thank you so much for joining. Thanks for the big crowd. Very amazed to see this, especially after a break and after lunchtime. I hope you have a great rest of the day. I hope you enjoy IAA. And if you have any questions, I'm still around, or you might also find us online on mckinsey.com. Thank you very much.